Hi, and welcome to Quilt Street. I'm Mary Kate Karr-Petras.
And I'm Rhonda Lother.
And today we're going to be talking about piecing. We're going to be sewing our quilt top and talking about some sewing basics. So let's just jump right in.
Let's do.
So we are demonstrating how to make a 9-patch block, which is probably the most classic, wouldn't you say?
And so many quilt blocks are based on that 9-patch assembly or the base. It's so versatile. It's a great learning tool.
Yes, you're going to find out as you get deeper into quilting, you're going to start seeing that 9-patch layout and seeing how maybe the different shapes within those patches intersect to create an overall design. Stay tuned, but we're going to start out with piecing an individual block. So we have a block library.
We do. Every quilt we feature on Quilt Street will also be in our block library, and those will be instructions to make just one single quilt block. And to me, that's a great tool because if you'll make a test block before you get started, just see how it goes. If you're happy with the fabric placement, I really love making a test block.
It's great. Even if the quilt that you're making doesn't include instructions for a basic block, it doesn't hurt to just start out with a test block before you go and cut all of your fabric, just to make sure you like the fabric placement, to make sure that you understand how it goes together. You probably won't have that issue with a 9-patch, but it never hurts. So we're going to talk about just the basic block. So the block that we are making for this quilt finishes at 6 inches. That means that each individual patch finishes at 2 inches. So therefore we cut our patches at 2.5 inches for that 1/4 inch seam allowance on all sides. So just rule of thumb, you add a 1/2 inch total seam allowance to the finished size to find out what size you're going to cut your patch when it comes to squares and rectangles.
Correct. But in the block library, we've already done the math for you. But just so you know, that's where we get it from.
Yes, that's our job. So I'm just going to lay out the patches for this block. Let me make sure that they are centered nicely. Okay, this pretty light pink blender goes here in the center. And then we've got this pretty teal blender that goes along the sides. And that's what it looks like. It's going to shrink up considerably when it's all pieced because, again, you've got a full inch of, a 1/2 inch of seam allowance in between each patch.
Right.
And the way we do it is we stitch in rows. But before we even get to the rows, we stitch in chains. And Rhonda's going to demonstrate that for us. So why don't you take it away?
Sure. The first thing I'm going to do is piece these two together. Note when we say right sides together or right sides facing, obviously your fabric has a right side and a wrong side. And we're going to put these right sides facing. Come to our machine. And I like to begin with a leader piece. This is just a little scrap fabric. You want to begin with your needle already in some fabric. And so we don't want to mess up our quilt pieces. So just use a little scrap. It's called a leader. Once it gets a bunch of threads on it, sometimes it's called a spider because it looks like it has a bunch of little legs on it. So I've often called it a spider. But let's just get that leader going. All right. Now, and again, I've placed my moleskin, so I have a nice little guide to send me toward my patchwork foot, that nice edge that we talked about in our last video. There goes
so you'll notice that she didn't lift the needle, she didn't reposition anything. She was just able to slide it in there, and that's where the feed dogs really come into play because they kind of grab that fabric or gently grab the fabric and kind of help pull it forward.
And you'll see how I'm putting in one piece after another without stopping or cutting the thread. This is called chain piecing because what the machine does, it connects all these with a chain of thread. And I also like to just use an ender piece as well, just so I'm ready to go to my next one. So I'm just going to clip this. And here's my chain. I'm going to just cut my leader off for now. This is what I mean by chain piecing. These have all gone together nicely. They're held together by a single thread. This also saves your the amount of thread you use. It's a more
Yes.
It definitely saves on thread and time. All right, now that I've trimmed these units apart, I'm going to pass them to Mary Kate.
Here we go. So we're just going to lay these out just to kind of show how they go, and it takes a little finagling. Sometimes you got to remember where they go. It doesn't hurt to reposition them so that, there we go. That looks right, right? Mm-hmm. So what we would do next is then you would go ahead, or Rhonda would go ahead and add these third patches to create the rows. But we're going to go into the other very important part of sewing, which is actually pressing or ironing, using the iron. Let's see, did you shut off on me? No, you're good. Okay, so we're just going to talk about that really quickly. Move this over. Now, some people like to press the seam. They set the seam, but let's make sure we got this going. You're going to want to press according to the pressing arrows that we have in our patterns. When all else fails, press your seams toward the darker fabric.
Right. Can't go wrong there.
And that's what we're going to do. So I'm just going to, I like to gently finger press open. I don't want to really distort the fabric. I'm not going to pull at it, but I like to give it a little finger press. As we've talked before about in our scant 1/4 inch seam allowance video, ooh, so steamy. That little bit of the fold itself takes up a little bit of fabric.
It does.
Right? It does take out some of the dimensions of the cut fabric, and the thread that's in the seam is also going to add a little bit of bulk, and it kind of will detract, and that's why that scant 1/4 inch is so important, because this is where you're going to see that. And you just press. You don't want to iron. You don't want to get a lot of muscle into it.
You don't want to distort, especially if you're using steam. I like to use steam, but just make sure you're not, like she's saying, pushing it out or ironing. You don't want to distort those pieces.
Right. So Rhonda would have pieced all of that, and you'll end up with 3 completed rows. Again, let's make sure we get these in the correct order for our block. It really never hurts. It never hurts to have a space near your sewing area where you can lay out your block, your pattern, your patches, so you get that visual. If you have a design wall, some vertical surface that has maybe a piece of flannel on it, there are a variety of ways that you can do this, but it's so important just to keep your patches straight.
It is. You can, sometimes I tape it to my wall right in front, or if you have an iPad or even your phone, if you're working from that, you can just prop that up and go by it.
Yeah, I've done that before where I'll take pictures of each step so I can go back and refer to it as I'm working. That's a great tip. It would be the same thing then. So now you've got your rows and you will join your rows. So you flip them right sides together. And again, based on the pressing arrows, you'll see we pressed these in opposite directions. And the nice thing about that is then the seams, they nest.
You can really feel it in your fingertips when you put those together.
That.
Yes, let's come back to the machine. And you can see these seams just butt together just like that. They nest. You can really feel it more than you can see it. You can really feel that. And I like to give this just a little pin to hold it in place. I pin before the actual seam, and I like to pin at an angle. Mary Kate likes to pin straight, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly fine. That pin's a little bent, so I'm going to grab another one. I like to pin on the diagonal, so it looks like this. That way I do not ever sew over my pin, so that gives me room. For me personally, if it's at an angle, I can pull it out more easily before it gets to the presser foot.
I don't know, you might convert me. I might start doing that, because it's true. Once the pins get up close to the presser foot, then you find yourself, it might be a little bit more difficult to pull them out.
So here it is, it's pinned, and the seams are nesting nicely. I'm going to put this in. And again, I would piece all of these units together at one time, chain piecing. I would not stop and start after each individual block, or unit rather, I shouldn't say block. So right before I get to the pin, we'll pull it out.
So you did not pin when you were piecing just the individual patches?
I didn't. I didn't feel like I needed that.
And that's, again, a personal choice, I would say, or a
Right.
your comfort level. I always say pin as much as you feel you need to, especially when you're starting out. There's absolutely nothing wrong with pinning, just for that sense of security. But you will find with smaller patches, the fabric sort of has a friction, you know, and they'll stay together. If they're cut well, they'll sort of stay together, and you're not going to get a lot of slippage, if any.
Yeah, for small pieces, I tend not to pin because they stay, like you said, they kind of adhere together well enough. But when I start getting to units, I do like to pin, and especially rows. But just to kind of check ourselves, again, I really like to check as I go. I'm going to open this up and see how these just match perfectly. Great.
Chef's kiss.
Thank you. But these all came together because we took care in the beginning. We cut carefully. We got our scant quarter inch seam allowance, and it just came together beautifully. And that's what you want. When you take all those steps into consideration, your seams just line up perfectly, and that's what we want.
Yep. No rippling, no ruffling. So then you would, in making this lone test block, you would then add the other row, press, and you will end up with, I'll let you take that away. Thank you. And I will then bring out just our completed little block. She's so cute.
So cute.
So sweet. And with this, I pressed the seams again toward the dark. There's going to be a place here where dark overlaps light.
And that's okay.
It's fine. It's going to happen. The more you build out your quilt, you're going to have to make these decisions, and it's fine. And that's what we end up with.
Precious block.
Now, in our pattern that we went over, especially since we're making multiples of the same exact block, cutting those individual patches would get pretty tedious and also allow a lot more room for error, you know, discrepancies just by a thread or two, perhaps, in the patches. So that's where we turn to strip piecing. And strip piecing is exactly how it sounds. You take 2 strips of fabric that are they usually run the width of the fabric and the length. And now it seems counterintuitive, but the length here is actually 2.5 inches. This is the strips. I cut them across the width of fabric. So this is actually the length, is 2.5 inches, similar to the size that we cut our square patches. And you would just piece those strips.
Right, we just put them together. The instructions will tell you to put them together right sides facing, which we're going to do. It looks just like this. We can look at the sewing machine. Let me get a leader started again. Again, I like to have a little piece to get my fabric going. There we go. And this is where I really like to have moleskin or some kind of a raised edge, whether it's one you purchased, like we showed in a previous video, or just simple moleskin or whatever. I really like that for strip sets because it kind of gives the fabric something to hug. Right. And it guides it easily, so I know it's going to hit that foot like I want it to. And so this is called strip piecing. When you're working with strips and you sew them together, it's simply called strip piecing. It almost kind of feeds itself. I'm getting off a little bit. There we go. It almost just guides itself at this point. Just we won't kind of keep a hand. Gently, I have a hand down here just to make sure these edges stay aligned. That's off camera, but we can see here. I've got this other hand holding these pieces.
And just stop and start as you need to. And again, we talked in an earlier video about the needle down position setting on your machine. This is where it comes in so handy, because when you need to stop to make sure that everything's aligned the way you want it, that needle is going to hold your strip set in place, or your whatever you're sewing is going to hold it in place in the machine. It's not going to come loose, and you've got this thread bobble going on.
Absolutely. So I'm going to pass this back to you, and once you've sewn 2 strips together, that's called a strip set. It's just like what it's just what it sounds like. It's a strip set. If you want to open that. And
again, if I were going to continue this, I would gently, now you can see, well, this is not sewn here, so that doesn't count.
I stopped early.
But you can see that you just give it a gentle finger press. I like to do a gentle finger press. And then I would, again, press that with the iron, and then I would, well, would I press this first, or would I add my other strip first?
I tend to go ahead and press first.
Do you?
It just depends. what you feel like doing. You can press it all at one time because in the strip sets for this pattern, you add a third row to complete the strip set, and you can either sew it all. You can either press it all at one time or press as you go. It's your choice.
And you could really get this kind of distorted. So this is where with pressing you do want to be sort of gentle and just not put a lot of muscle into it, but pass it over. So I'm going to give that to you. And then what you end up with after you've added that third strip is your completed strip set. Voila! And in order to make a 9 patch, you need to make 2 strip sets. So you need to make the strip set that's going to go here, these 2 outer units, and then you need the center unit for that alternating placement, right?
Right.
And you'll also note, and this is all covered in the instructions of the pattern, but just kind of get into your head, you're going to need twice as many of these strip sets as you need of this, because you need 2 strip set units per block of the outer and only 1 of the center unit.
Exactly. All right, so Mary Kate has a strip set that's already sewn together, and the instructions tell us to cut this into 2.5-inch wide increments. So that's what she's doing right now.
Oops.
Taking time to line up the ruler correctly. Take whatever time you need. You want this to be accurate. I know we keep saying that over and over, but it's better to take your time and get that measurement right.
If I were doing this at home, I would be not sitting and I would be, right up over it a little bit more. So that's it.
There it is. That's her center unit. And she would continue cutting straight across in 2.5-inch increments to get the number of units that are indicated in the instructions.
Yep.
And that's strip piecing, strip cutting.
Yep. Easy peasy. So we've made all of our blocks.
Yes.
Now it's time to make the rows. And in this quilt, we have, as you know, called them setting squares. They might also be called alternate squares sometimes. So they alternate. And the nice thing about this pattern is you don't have any matching seams.
I like that a lot.
Yeah,
it's very forgiving.
Very forgiving. It's great for a beginner quilt. Sometimes you'll see patterns that really rely on the seams of the blocks intersecting in a particular way to create an overall design. We don't have that with this quilt, which is really nice. So you would just do the same thing. You would just join out alternating block, alternate square block, alternate square, depending on the formation that's given in the pattern. Piece those.
Make your rows. And then our next step would be...
Do you chain piece rows as well?
I do, actually. I do tend to chain piece. You could sew all of these together as you go.
You're kind of working.
Yes.
Because the way we normally do it is we lay out the rows in horizontal rows, and then we join the horizontal rows down.
Right.
So you would chain piece kind of vertically, and then that's where having the area to lay out your quilt is so important, because you just want to make sure you don't get things out of order. I think I tend to piece row by row. But that, again, has to do with the space that I have available and just sort of my approach. There's no one wrong way. No. So you would do that. I'll give those to you. And then we do have a couple of completed rows here. So I'm just going to push this out of the way so we can lay them out on our table. I'll give you these pins. Thanks.
So you notice we have alternating rows, which means the way these come together, you have alternating setting squares with blocks. So once again, you're not trying to align seams in the middle. I just love the way this offsets like that.
Just move this so we can see the whole thing. There we go. There we have it. Yeah. And then how do you piece rows?
I join them together from here. I would put them together right sides facing. They alternate. I would take these and put them together right sides facing. And show us how we nest those seams again.
Sure. Let's find a spot right here. And again, it was more of a feel than it was visual.
It really
I could feel when those seams locked right in. So when you get that, you can kind of slide as necessary to make sure that the raw edges are aligned. And then you pin.
What I like to do is pin, want to help? I like to pin the center so that my block stays nice and centered. And I'll also pin right where those seams are going to
I'll
adjust.
let you do that.
And again, I like to maybe sometimes catch the seam allowance. And again, I really like to pin diagonally so I can pull those out when I get to the machine. But you can really feel those seams nest or butt up against one another without overlapping. Pin, and then we would simply sew the rows together and just keep going, sewing rows.
And do you sew row to row to row and build it out, or do you sew rows in pairs and then maybe join the pairs out?
I tend to join row to row. I don't really do pairs. I know some people do, but I prefer to join each row individually as I go, so it continues to grow. And when I'm doing that, this might be a time where I would switch out my normal area here to the extension table we showed earlier, because as your quilt grows, you might need a little more surface area to work with, and that's just a handy thing for me to do, is to have that extension table on.
And you're going to find that you have a lot of increasing bulk sitting in your lap to start with, and you just kind of take the time you need to sort of arrange it. You don't want any drag on your needle, so sometimes when I'm sewing, and I've got rows sitting here in my lap, they might get stuck or caught on the edge of the table, so you want to always be continually poofing it up.
Fluff it up, keep it going.
To keep it nice and slack so that it doesn't drag or catch, and it can just, you can just keep sewing. So again, it's that needle down position will help you. As you're sewing, you can stop, readjust, make sure that everything is going nice and neat. You don't need to sew pedal to the metal, especially as a beginner. And you never need to sew pedal to the metal.
If you need to, adjust that speed like we talked about earlier. Set your machine to a lower speed, because sometimes that foot can get away from you and you kind of zip.
It really
I'm
can.
a threat to do that. And sometimes it helps just to lower that speed just a little bit so things don't get away from you.
This is the time to turn on that podcast or, whatever you like to listen to, and just sort of assembly line it. And you're going to end up with a beautiful throw quilt. It can be used as a baby quilt, toddler quilt as I like to call them, or a nice throw lap quilt. You can make it in any variety of fabrics that you like. And it's just a beautiful size. It's an easy project. And it's really satisfying.
It really is. It really is.
Well, thank you. And in our next video, we're going to be talking about basting and preparing your quilt top for quilting.